Okay, so let's get started. So good evening, everybody, and welcome to session 3 of this very interesting series we're having. Hope you're enjoying it. I hope you've been finding and reading the pieces. Um, I'll tell you that the next two are in a book. It's probably in more than one place, but I know it's in a book, an anthology called Moral Disorder, and the library's got a copy, but it's checked out at the moment. But then also, um, a number of libraries around have it. So within 3 weeks, you should all be able to get your hands on it to be able to read them if that's how you want to do it. Um, the only other thing I want to mention is that 3 weeks from now, where our session will be in the afternoon on Tuesday uh, at the library in person. Mark will be coming down, and I hope to see quite a number of you there. We will point a camera at Mark so that if you can't come, you don't live anywhere around here, etc., you can still watch it on Zoom the way we've been doing it. But I'd like to have a nice in-person version of this, and as long as that works, we'll do the final 3 sessions that way in the library. So I will send you all a note probably the end of next week. I'm going to be on vacation. So I'll send you all a note at the end of next week, and you can just tell me very quickly with 2 words, you're coming in person or you're watching on Zoom. And that way I'll know about how many people are coming, and we can set the room up correctly and everything else. So with all of that, I'm going to turn it over to Mark. He's going to speak for 15 minutes or so, and then we'll be looking for responses and comments and questions from you based upon what he's going to prompt you with. So turn it over to Mark.
Thank you, Michael, as always, and thank the library, the funding, Michael for his good work, and all of you for coming out so often. So this story, No Name Woman, was the first of 5 stories in a collection called The Woman Warrior, subtitled Memoirs of a Girlhood Among Ghosts, published in 1976 to great acclaim and some controversy that I may or may not talk about later. But she was born in America, lived in San Francisco. She was born of Chinese immigrant parents. And of the story, and it was an award-winning book. 4 years later, in 1980, it was accompanied by a companion volume called China Men, What Happened to the Men that she mentions in No Name Women who left their village to come to America. I read this book in 1976 as a graduate student at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. One of my teachers said to me, as a teacher, Mark, you're very steeped in the literature of dead white American men and European men and British men, but what have you read of Asia, of the of India, of South America? What have you read of not African American literature, but American literature? He said, if you want to be taken seriously in the 1970s as a teacher of literature, start reading more. And he suggested that I would have the bandwidth, even as a Ph.D. candidate, to read 1 book a month off my assigned reading. And the first book I read was The Woman Warrior, and was blown away by this first story. And the opening line, which I continue to think is one of the best lines in literature for reasons I'll explain. You must never tell anyone, my mother told me, what I'm about to tell you. When you consider that that is a command from her mother not to repeat what she's about to tell her, that got published in 1976, she's 36 at the time, to worldwide fame. Just extraordinary. You need to know some terms from the Fuller novel to understand what's happening in the book. The Woman Warrior is the epithet used for a fictional character from the 4th to 6th century of the Christian era, whose name was Fa, F-A, sometimes spelled differently, Mulan, M-U-L-A-N, who was a kind of Chinese Joan of Arc character, a woman who took her father's place in the cavalry when he was required to serve. He was old and frail, and she served her family by becoming an extraordinary warrior disguised as a male. Until Disney made the Mulan movie some years ago, most Americans would have no reference to Mulan. So the broader context of the book, the collection of stories, it's an homage to a woman who has erased her sexuality in order to serve not just her country, China wasn't a nation then, but her family. And in the myth, she has on her back as scars the wrongs that were done to her family by their enemies, and she is out for revenge. So she not only serves the village and serves the country, she's also an avenging angel for her family. She's as far away from the no name woman of this story in that that woman, no name woman, is being erased. Now, I would guess that most of you would be hard pressed without looking to remember what the last word of this story is. It's substitute. It's that the reflection of the narrator in the water is of her ancient, unnamed ancestor, who, if she gets too close, will pull her down and grab her substitute. The ant will grab Maxine as a substitute and make her suffer underwater. Substitute is what Mulan does for her father. Substitution, in that sense, is great service. It's an act of daughterly piety. It's an act of patriotism, again, even though there's no nation yet. It's an act of revenge, and her body becomes a text. So she not only has a legendary name, Fa Mulan, that is famous, she herself is a story. So one thing you need to know is the context of woman warrior and how no name woman undercuts that. Secondly, when the subtitle says a memoir or memoirs, plural, of a girlhood among ghosts, the ghosts that Maxine refers to, and it's hinted at in this story, are of two kinds. It's the very colorless Americans who have such pale skin that they seem like the dead. And her immigrant parents, and when I say immigrant, I don't mean ignorant. Her mother was a professional woman in China. These were educated people. I only mean they were new to the country. So many people make negative associations with the word immigrant, especially in the current climate. Her parents believed that the Americans in their paleness did not have the substance that Chinese people had. And so they referred to them as ghosts, and they spoke to their children about the Americans as ghosts. They weren't trying to be pejorative, they thought it was an accurate description of their paleness and their lack of being robust. But the Chinese people, including her parents, also referred to their ancestors as ghosts, not the no name woman, but the many ancestors that every Chinese person has who are honored all the time at personal temples in the home, through memories and stories. So her ancestors were also thought of as ghosts and referred to as ghosts in the positive sense of spirits that never leave. And so Maxine explains in the larger book that she was caught between two kinds of ghosts, these colorless Americans who she thought had no connection to her and who her parents talked about as not having vigor, and the ancestors that her parents knew about, but she did not. And her problem, she states in the larger book, is if she's going to become an American, a true American, how does she translate, that's the word she uses, her experience into something that makes sense to her double heritage of Chinese background but of American birth? Another term you have to know is that the Chinese, at least according to Kingston, had a habit of doing what was called talk story. Parents, usually the mother, educated their children about the world, about their background, about relatives and ancestors, about things like the dangers of becoming pregnant by doing a talk story. That is, having a story that was maybe true or maybe fabricated or maybe some collection of both, while making a point that was instructive. So it had something of a kind of sermon and something of a kind of narrative. Now, many Americans of whatever background have in their own past that kind of story being told by parents. Parents, by their nature, tell stories to their children that are meant to be instructive, sometimes amusing and sentimental, sometimes cautionary, well, as here. But talk story is a feature of the book, The Woman Warrior. Lastly, this story is remarkable in that our series is on rites of passage, coming of age. And this is a coming of age story because Maxine is told this story by her mother when she begins to menstruate. When she becomes capable of becoming pregnant, her mother has to tell her, she feels, this cautionary tale. So it's a coming of age story, and the story that's told within the story is a coming of age story. It's about what her aunt did wrong from the point of view of the village and the point of view of her mother, at least in her silence of not criticizing her. It's a coming of age story about a coming of age story. All of the stories we're reading this program, including the next three when I'll be in person, are coming of age stories. So here's the irony that is like, you must never tell anyone, my mother said, what I'm about to tell you. No name woman cannot have a name because she has been shamed. The shame, of course, is the shame of male honor, which is, of course, itself a shame. Um, Honor killing, honor exiles have happened not just in Chinese culture, but in American culture. I can assure you that there are poor, dead, shunned, maimed, abused women within 100 miles of where I'm sitting now in Connecticut who have been the victim of punishment by their families for their shame, which of course is another name for male pride. I don't mean the women are innocent, and I'm not preaching now, this is fact. The men have so much invested of their honor in the bodies of women, of the virginity of women, the virtues of women. Don't men have virginity? Apparently not. That this story is enlightening for what it reveals about the abuse in another country of things that happen in this country as well. More common, I'm told, in the South than in the Northeast, but it happens in all kinds of families and not just recent immigrants. And so, one of the things this story does is it makes a coming of age story about a woman who cannot be named but has to be invoked. So, she's given a no name name. It's like at a press conference, if you ask a politician a question, she can say nothing. She can say nothing, be quiet, and then there's no answer. Or she can affirmatively say, I have no comment. And then what she's done is she gives a no answer answer. There is a place filler for the thing she hasn't said. And what has she said? No comment. That's exactly what this is like. The mother has to call the aunt something. She is a woman with no name. And Maxine has to give her story, she feels, a title, and the title is No Name Woman. The woman has no name, but she has an identity. She has a character. She has a story. And the glory of this particular story, and I admire this endlessly, it is the best story in the volume. It's better than anything else I've read by Kingston, even though I admire her writing, is that she figured out a way to make this history of this erased woman not be erased. And in the story, she goes into great detail, as you know from reading it, of the kinds of things her aunt must have done to make herself more attractive, to make herself desirable to this man who took her, maybe by force. All that's said in the story is she was told to lie down. And I'm not splitting hairs now. I'm not one of those people who said, well, was it a rape or not a rape? She could not have refused him. given their sexes, given the likely positions in the society, given their genders, but how complicit she was in wanting it to happen is a question we don't have to touch upon. She goes into detail about how she removed the fine hairs from her neck and face, how she was foolishly advertising that she was a wanted woman without meaning to, because she was smitten. And it's very poignant that although we know early in the story that she's dead, stuffing herself in a well to poison the water against the villagers, we know that the villagers came and broke in the front and back doors even though they were unlocked. We know that the man who impregnated her was almost certainly one of the people who abused the family and probably beat her, and maybe wore a mask so he wouldn't be identified by her. All those details are given early, and then we were given, in a kind of retrospect, the very poignant description of what this young girl did to try to make herself a kind of wife to this other man. She also explained the dynamics of the poverty of the sons having to go off. Remember, she's the only woman in her family. The sons going off to make their fortune in America. And like other nations or other countries that sent men to be the sort of anchor, get a job, make a living, send money back home until they could afford to bring their family over or until they could afford to go back to the village and be successful. Lastly, I'll say we have to be mindful of the extreme deprivation of her family and of so many villages in early 20th century America, China. The lack of food of these people who were often dirt poor, and dirt poor comes from the idea that your abode can't afford a floor and you're living on the earth. The, the floor under your feet is dirt. That's where the expression comes from. And she mentioned something in passing that I remember seeing as a college student in Chinatown when I lived in New York City. A grandmother at the table in a very authentic Chinese restaurant, the only kind of restaurant I wound up eating in Chinatown, was handing a bowl of food, a small bowl, and you've seen the manner that Chinese people who are traditional use two chopsticks, sometimes to pick up like a scissors, sometimes to scoop like a spoon. And they hold a small bowl of rice under their face and they add different bits of food from what is often a kind of lazy Susan setup. And they mix the food and the rice and whatever sauce they have with extraordinary agility, avoiding forks and spoons even into the 21st century. And this grandmother was handing such a bowl out to a boy who might have been 8, and he wasn't looking, and he took it with only one hand, or he tried to take it with only one hand. And she scolded him with a low voice, but with a lot of emotion in Chinese, because he was in danger, as we know from this story, of dropping the bowl, that he did not have the respect she expected him to have for food. And this was in America, in New York City, of a family that I could tell, at least by their demeanor and their clothes, were not indigent. But the grandmother knew the value of food and the horrors of poverty. And that's also a subtext in The No Name Woman. So I hope you found the story interesting even before these explanations. And I hope knowing something about Fa Mulan, knowing something about the double meaning of ghosts, knowing something about how substitution plays in the story, recognizing the irony of being told a story that she's not supposed to tell and then publishing it. And lastly, how the story divides its attention in a non schismatic way between being honest about the punishment that the woman suffers, but the narrator taking the time after the attack on the household to give us details about a woman begins to have a kind of human identity. I'll end there and say that I hope this story resonated enough with you that you'll be able to carry much of the conversation from here on. So, Michael, I'll turn it over to you, and I hope you all found that helpful.
Okay, Mark, thanks. So folks, you know the drill. Use the Q&A to put any questions or comments in there, and I'll relay them. I'll just say in the meantime that the idea of telling a story that starts out with being told that you're not supposed to tell it, I read it as an interesting, literary technique. But hearing that, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, but hearing that this may be even more memoir-like, so reflecting the reality of her family's history, that kind of changes my view of the opening of the story. It's one thing to use that as a device. It's another thing to have someone actually tell you, do not tell anybody this, and then you go and write it down and get it published.
Yeah. All of us have had the experience, I imagine, whether in our families or in friends' families or maybe in movies or books, where you know that the family dynamic of all kinds of nationalities and demographics is that there are certain things you don't talk about when dad's people are here. When Aunt Eleanor is going to be at dinner tonight, we don't talk about Uncle Ned when Aunt Eleanor is here. I think everybody knows that either from first, second, or third hand experience. My people and your people. Sometimes it's not fraught with angst, but sometimes it's very tense. There are some families that take out and put away wedding gifts when people visit because there's a tension between this family and that family. This idea that the mother is serving her husband, whose sister, it's the mother's sister who was that aunt, did this terrible thing. And the mother, whose American version of her Chinese name is Moon Orchid, feels that her maternal requirement is to tell her daughter this story as a cautionary tale.
So Sarah's got a comment asking, foot binding was mentioned, but I
Yeah,
thought upper classes bound feet, not rural villagers.
yeah. Well, I don't know enough about the particulars. Remember, it's not happening in this family, but there's nothing to stop any family from aspiring to be upper class feeling, even though they're not. And so, whether there were indigent villagers who had daughters buying their feet, hard to know. We know that some Chinese families and some Greek families and some ancient Roman families left girl babies out on hillsides to be eaten by animals and to die. And it was an accepted practice because girls were inferior children. And in a society like Greek society that celebrated mental health and physical health, the Olympics, um, Roman society that was a warrior society, girls were seen as a bad lot. And that was not something that the government or the polity agonized about, even though, of course, individual people may have been destroyed in their emotions by that. Um, so whether there were families that did something different about their daughters because they aspired to be seen as gentility, the gentry, I don't know.
Got it. So Lisa is
Even that,
commenting. Yeah,
I'm
go
sorry,
ahead.
even that is uh, hurting and creating pain for a woman on some model of feminine beauty. That you have to be demure, you have to be petite, your feet have to be small, and figured out a way to do it by distorting your bones. Your feet don't grow because your bones are stunted. It's horrible.
So Lisa's got a comment and a question. I found it a little disjointed paragraph to paragraph, but I'm curious about Mark's view on that. Is there any literary reason for that technique, if it actually is a technique?
Well, of course, we may disagree about how disjointed it is. Uh, I would say the major literary technique is to shock us with that opening sentence, which is still very powerful to me all these years later, to tell us the story of the attack of the villagers, of this woman giving birth in a pigsty, of her dragging herself to a well and stuffing her and her baby down the well in an act of spite because she believed that it would poison the water and bring curses down upon the villagers. That shocking opening, which treats the woman as a victim, which she is, but doesn't give her any identity. She's barely mentioned in the attack on the household. But then the register of the story completely changes, and the narrator imagines what her aunt went through, what her aunt went through in the rape, seduction, impregnation, whatever you want to call it, in being at least enough interested in the man to want him to desire her in Maxine's imagination. And of course, that imagining is an act of emotional empathy. She's imagining what her aunt went through. That's a kind of substitution. Maxine knows none of this. You can be sure that her mother did not give any details about her sister in law's toilette. She wasn't going to be talking about hairstyle. And Maxine takes what she knows about Chinese culture from her mother, from the pictures of her female ancestors, and talks about whether you wore flaps or buns and how you could arrange your hair so it could fall down easily into long hair if you wanted it to happen. And I think it's an amazing act of cultural imagination for Maxine to take from this very striking story of assault and abuse of a family member, this young woman, very young woman, by family and friends and neighbors, and then build out of that this emotional empathy that Maxine, as a woman herself, as a Chinese woman, and as a writer, is able to invest in the story. So I don't think it's disjointed that the tone of the attack by the villagers is radically different from the bulk of the story. And I think it's brilliant that at the end, she imagines that as she looks at the reflection of herself, Maxine, the way we all do, a river, a pond, a lake is a kind of mirror. When we reflect upon what we look like, and maybe there's some female vanity, men have vanity too, but she's a female. I don't mean that it's peculiar to women. Maybe there's some sense in which she's looking at herself admiringly. Maybe she's trying to imagine in her features whether her aunt looked like her. It was her father's sister. Maybe there's some blood connection. And then worrying that the myth she's heard, that when the Chinese myth, that when you look at your reflection, the imp on the other side of the water will pull you down and drown you if you get too close. That was a myth that was supported by the idea that people used to fall into water. They got too close, they slipped, they were drunk, they were whatever, and people died, and they made up the story that, oh, they got too close to their own opposite. But she doesn't talk about an opposite. She talks about her aunt, and she has substitutes because she imagines that her aunt is eager to get out of her ghostly suffering by putting Maxine in her place. Not a hero like the Mulan warrior of myth, but a person to take her place as a prisoner.
So I've got a few comments that I think we can kind of combine them together because they're linked by a common, I guess, theme of the cruelty that's being described in the story. Anne says, I was horrified by the details of the break-in of the house. Did the author need to be so graphic? Paul says, as a depiction of human cruelty, I feel the story is in a class by itself. I found it powerful, but very disturbing to read. And Daniel added, the destruction rendered on the family was brutal in its premeditation. Given the poverty this kind of, given their poverty, this kind of degradation seems impractical.
Yeah. So who was the woman who made the first comment?
And
So Anne, and I'm not putting on the spot. You don't have to answer this through Michael, but when you said that it's too graphic, do you mean that it was excessive artistically, that it was inappropriate for her to go into that kind of detail, or did you just mean it's very hard to take? You don't have to answer that if you choose not to, but I'd like you to have the chance to if you want. So while we wait, and Anne, again, you can take a pass and not say anything. As a feminist, as a father of daughters, as a man who believes that women have been disenfranchised in America and around the globe in many, many ways, I think there's no value in prettifying what the family did. And that what Maxine is doing is taking the note of trespass, which is how the story opens. Never tell anyone this, and you're being told it at the same time. The story opens with Maxine disobeying her mother spectacularly. So she's a trespasser, she's a violator. I think there's no virtue in sugarcoating, and I'm not accusing any of our commenters of what I'm saying now, and holding back on just how horrific this was. There is a kind of sensationalism. Movies are guilty of it, where they show rape scenes in detail, not because they're trying to say, isn't this horrible, but they know that people have a sadistic interest in such kinds of details. I don't think that's what the author is doing here. I'll say this as someone who's taught literature for all my adult life. If I had not read this story when I did, thanks to my mentor in graduate school, I might have come across, through one kind of nonfiction reading or another, some description of this practice in China. And it may be that without reading literature in the sense of belles lettres, imaginative literature, a novel, a memoir that is partly created from the author's imagination because she fills in details she didn't live through, she wasn't told. I may have found a book and I may have learned something about this practice in villages in 19th and 20th century China. But you can be sure that the number of us, Michael, how many people are in this Zoom room tonight?
about 40.
That the 40 people gathered here, and Michael and I, would not be having this conversation about such a nonfiction book. In general, libraries and book groups and scholars like me do not do book groups about nonfiction. There are exceptions, and maybe many exceptions. But what makes the book so powerful is it's not just a novel, that is, not a novel, imaginative literature. It's a combination of what she remembers and what she's inventing about someone in her past. And it's a work of literature where the attack by the village runs through Maxine's consciousness. And we talk about it tonight, and we know something we would not have known if we hadn't read the story. That's glorious. That's one of the great gifts of literature, is that you not only feel things you might not have felt, you actually learn stuff. I remember that one of my book group hosts in his home, Ray Armstrong, dead now 20 years or more, used to say that every season we should pick some books where the people in the group learn something about 19th century St. Petersburg, or something about um, Eastern Europe before the Holocaust. Not in a didactic way, but we should read a novel where the imaginary characters are living in history, and that history would teach us something. He was hungry for some facts among the feelings.
So Anne posted a reply to your question. She said, I thought it was a bit sensational, a very distressing to read on a lovely spring evening.
Yeah, well, Anne, I think I know this, Anne, and I want to thank you for your generosity of coming back. I want to say that you take the risk whenever you read a book that your evening, spring or otherwise, can be ruined. There are many books that are very hard to take. But I will say this, and I appreciate your sensitivity to this. It is possible as a new author, again, she was 36 when this got published. This was her first major publication. It's possible that knowingly or unknowingly, she made it a little sensational to sell books or to impress people about her seriousness, her gravity. It is the first story. It is by far, in my opinion, the best story. It's the most anthologized of the four stories in the book. And so there may be some wisdom in what you're saying, Anne, that she may have gone a little too far. But my own feeling as a man, as a father, as a grandfather, as a husband, formerly, as a reader, is that she gets a lot of leeway when you imagine that this actually happened countless times as part of a tradition that was not just permitted, but honored, required. You know, one of the most impressive slogans during the long debate about abortion was a bumper sticker that said, if men could get pregnant, abortion would be a sacrament. And I was a practicing Catholic then who had very mixed feelings about abortion. And I saw the wisdom in that. That is, this happened not just to this aunt, but to countless women in China and other nations too. And I give the writer who wants to open it up a lot of leeway on the sensation scale.
Got it. Now, Lori has said,
And I appreciate Anne's getting back to me.
so Lori's comment is, and yet, despite the carnage of that opening scene, which I too found horrifying and gripping, Kingston says towards the end of the story, quote, the real punishment was not the villagers' raid, but the families deliberately forgetting her. I practically lost my breath when I read that sentence.
Yeah. And again, some of you may have personal histories in your family or in your extended families or in your in-law families of learning late in life that you had a relative who you didn't know existed because the family consciously or unconsciously erased him, or more typically her. That's not an uncommon thing, not only not to talk about them, but not to talk about not talking about them until people find out they had siblings that they never knew they had. And not because it was a baby who died young, but because there was some scandal. And the scandal almost always has to do with sexuality, with sexual honor, sometimes with class consciousness. But you know, history, even American history of quote unquote fine families, is littered with silences about relatives we didn't know we had. And remember, the woman warrior's body is a text of the wrongs that have been done. It is a proclamation on her back, carved into her back, of what people have done to her family. She's an avenger. There is no one to avenge the aunt. And at the end, the aunt is not only not honored as a relative by Maxine, Maxine figures her as possibly making her a substitute. That is, the aunt doesn't want to claim a familial relationship with Maxine. The aunt wants Maxine to take her place. Very different from making a family connection.
So Alan's comment is that he found this a remarkably intense revelation about how little the hosts understand about immigrants. We know they suffer economically, socially, etc., but the story makes us live through incredible pressures. As such, I found this much closer to an essay than a short story, and as such, a very successful medium for making those points.
That was Alan?
Yes.
Yeah. So as Michael knows, because we had a little conversation about this in the green room, this story is sometimes collected in anthologies of essays. There's a good one by Joyce Carol Oates, where it's not put in literature as a short story or memoir, it's put in as an essay. And that's because shortly after it came out, there was some pushback from Chinese immigrants in America, Chinese Americans, some Chinese in China, that Maxine was embracing stereotypes that were no longer true, and that she was doing a disservice to her people, and that since the memoir of this story is largely not what she remembers, but what she imagines, that it would be fairer to call this particular story not a story, but an essay. And there's a collection of essays by Joyce Carol Oates, who we read, a very prominent writer and editor, that categorizes this as an essay. I have no problem with that. I recognize the mixed mode that most of the power of the story is imagined by a writer who was not there. And so only the frame is a kind of memoir. But I want to say this about the notion of what is unleashed on the reader about violence and what's very upsetting. And I'll be anecdotal, but briefly. A very dear uncle in law of mine, dead now for decades, heard that, and a father of 5 daughters, heard that there was going to be an ABC special called Something About Amelia. And some of you may remember this was a primetime movie about incest, about a family where the father was abusing one of the daughters. Whether she was the only daughter or not, I don't remember. And this man, my Uncle Michael, Mickey, of 5 daughters, was disgusted that whatever network was putting this on TV, told his wife and daughters they were not going to watch it, and was angry with the network for making it something that was not only marketable, but apparently educational, something about Amelia. And of course, the something is that she's a victim of incest abuse. Now, this is a long time ago, and much more is known now about familial uh, violence, sexual violence in families. But Uncle Mickey did not want it to be something that was part of his household, even if it served a purpose to let his daughters know this happened other places. I am sure it wasn't that he had any mixed emotions about it from his own guilt. This man was truly a saint. But I felt I had an obligation as a teacher of literature and as a father of daughters myself. My first child was a daughter, my third child was a daughter, to say to him, Uncle Mickey, if you don't watch it, do you think it doesn't actually happen? He said, no, I believe it happens. Well, if it happens, isn't that what's horrible? If you don't watch the TV show, you're not undoing the fact that this happens to boys and girls and is happening now. It's probably happening this moment. I said, if it happens, it's the happening that you hate, not the depiction of it. He said, yes, but why put it on TV? Uncle Mickey, so that people who don't believe it happens, don't understand why it happens, can have a better understanding of the way the world works. That's one of the functions of literature. Now, I'm not saying that he went out and bought stock in ABC television. I'm not saying that when it was rerun, he was in the front row. But I think I made some headway, and that's my credo as a teacher of literature. However horrible you think something is, and some of my book groups would decline to do books about the Holocaust because it was too upsetting to read. They weren't Holocaust deniers. Many of the people who declined were themselves Jewish Americans. Some of them were likely the descendants of Holocaust survivors or victims. They just were tired of the onslaught. They were tired of what some people in the group tonight characterized as just too hard to take. I respect that. And I never said to them, we're going to do it whether you like it or not. It was their book group, not mine. But I did make the point that not reading a book about the Holocaust doesn't make the Holocaust go away. And if enough people stop reading books about the Holocaust, it will go away because our children and our children's children won't have knowledge of the Holocaust as part of their touchstone of everyday life. And again, I'm not trying to sound preachy, but it's important to me. Michael, where are we on time?
We are at 13 minutes to the hour.
So I want to invite anyone who has any kind of comment, even if it doesn't fit into the flow of what we've been talking about so far, anyone who has a radically different view, anyone who wants to bring up another topic. I don't want to dominate this conversation with my own autobiography or preachiness. So let's take a moment, and if someone wants to add something new, I welcome it.
Well, and in the meantime, I've got a couple of others just hanging out here. Liz says, to me, the tragedy of the extreme motivation that fear and ignorance played in driving the behaviors of the villagers was continued by the fear reflected in Maxine's mother's message of don't tell. The significance of her telling the tale is perhaps that she is breaking the cycle of fear and ignorance by breaking the silence surrounding the cruelty.
Yeah. Yeah, it's certainly possible, given the mother's intelligence, that she knows that by telling the story and making her daughter not tell it, that she actually knows that she's going to promote it, and that there's enough sisterhood in her feeling about her sister-in-law to know that the person who's embargoing the story, the person who wants the silence, is the husband who feels that his male pride, his male honor, has been besmirched by his sister. That's the heart of most honor crimes, honor killings. It's the men and their sense of their own importance and honor. It's a horrible name to give it. It's so dishonorable. So you could imagine, we're free to imagine, that Moon Orchid is a savvy enough mother, woman, maybe wife, to tell her daughter the story and tell her not to repeat it in the same way that Milton knew that when the angel said, Adam and Eve, you can have anything you want in this entire paradise except the fruit of that tree, that as soon as he left, Eve would say, you know, that tree's looking pretty tasty. Tipper Gore had the idea of labeling long playing vinyl records. Ask somebody if you don't know what those are. As having explicit lyrics, and she didn't realize kids went to the stores looking for that label because they wanted what they were told not to have. It's certainly possible in our own imagination of the background of the mother that she told Maxine so Maxine would tell the story. I don't believe she knew she was talking to someone who years later would become an acclaimed and published author, but it may be that she didn't mind. I hope
Okay.
that.
Yeah. So here's Jean's comment. The story made me think about the author's sense of self and her reference group. How could she identify with the old world with their brutality and awful attitude about women? And in the US, as a second generation, her ethnic group was viewed as lesser than white people, despite any education level or level of professionalism. It makes me think she must have really aspired for a new persona, an American product of the melting pot with a new perspective. Kudos to her for not leaving her heritage behind as she moved on to a new role.
Yes, and let's remember that even though it was a Japanese, remember she's born in 1940, it was the Japanese that were put in concentration camps in America because of what they looked like, because we were at war with Japan. We were at war with Nazi Germany. German Americans were not put in concentration camps in America. Italian Americans, for the time that we were at war with Italy, did not. It's not because we were fighting them, it's because they didn't look like us, the Japanese. You can be sure that a Chinese girl in 1940s and 50s in California looking like a Chinese girl would not have been treated well, even if they made the distinction between Japanese and Chinese. Everyone here of a certain age knows the kind of terrible aspersions that were cast on Chinese people in the language and the slang. Also, her being a girl, being a woman, would not have helped her. So when we talk about what she knew about her heritage, 1940s and 50s America, I was born in 1953. I love this country still. Don't ask me why, but I do. Was no bargain for someone who was an immigrant, who didn't look American, and who was female. That's something, a burden that she faced like many, many other women. You know, part of the reasons why African American bigotry lasted so long is it was harder to hide your heritage. And the same thing was true with people with distinctly Asian features. Also, it has to be said that biology is not a friend to women in their long history of abuse. In one of the first novels that became a bestseller in America, 1850's The Scarlet Letter by Nathaniel Hawthorne, the only writer in his day before Mark Twain who was believed to be a world famous writer. People at the time thought he was a writer for the ages. They didn't think that of Melville or Cooper. They didn't think of that Emerson or Thoreau until you got to Mark Twain decades later. You don't get another writer who people say this American writer can stand us along the British and continental writers. He writes the Scarlet Letter. In that story, a woman who's married but living in the colonies without her husband is impregnated by a man who is the preacher for the village, for the Puritan village, where the preacher is like a government official. He is the highest moral authority, and he has impregnated this woman. His his act of complicity does not show, or he only had to survive the sperm. His physical being is not changed. But the mother, of course, shows her pregnancy. And what do? They imprison her. She gives birth in prison, not a pigsty. And the novel opens with her coming out of the prison. And it's commented that the short road of Main Street that Hester and her child, her infant child, Pearl, are stepping out of is on one end, and on the other end is a cemetery. That the Puritans' Main Street runs from punishment to death. Hester has a nobility of her own, and despite her ill treatment by the town and by her impregnator, they may or may not actually be lovers, that's debatable. She's the one who takes the rap because Dimsdale, the preacher, and that's his name, Dimsdale, suggesting his hidden identity, is absolutely as guilty, and maybe more so since he was a cleric and her spiritual advisor, and he keeps his mouth shut for almost the entire novel.
So
And we
Mark,
all
I've got to, you go ahead.
the pregnant girls in Ireland whose pregnancy showed, and the Magdalen laundries, and if you read Small Things Like These, the great novel some years ago by Claire Keegan, women's transgression, in quotation marks, is outed by their biology. And we know women have aborted their babies, not just because they didn't want the baby, they didn't want to show they were pregnant for whatever reason. A horrible thing.
Sure. So Janet's got a question that's definitely from a different angle on this. And she says, will you please talk about Maxine's contribution to humanity, Vietnam vets, and how does she find a common ground between the two ghosts in her life?
So this is Janet.
Yeah.
Janet, are you talking about philanthropic work you know she did for Vietnam vets? Because if you are, you know more than I'm prepared to talk about this evening. I confess that although I know this story and her work, her literary work very well, I do not know a lot about her larger life or activities. And if you know more, and you want to channel it through Michael, that's fine with me. I'd like to honor her in any way you'd like to. As for the question about ghosts, as we come up to the end of our hour, I'm not sure I could say easily or succinctly how anyone, Maxine or anyone else, negotiates the fact that your ancestry is largely invisible to you, and you are taught that the people living in America alongside you are barely visible as well.
Okay, and Sarah is asking, it's related to some of the things I think we were talking about before. Sarah's asking, do we need to know Kingston's family story to fully understand this coming of age story?
So, fully understand is a complicated expression. I don't think we ever fully understand anything. I hope that what you take away is that this very visceral, in your face story modulates into a kind of delicacy in which Maxine, by her honoring, thinking about her aunt as an actual person, resurrects her more forcibly than telling her story about the transgression or the honor killing or even the ending about her being a substitute. The humanity of Kingston's story is on those middle paragraphs where she imagines, in a charming kind of even sentimental way, what her aunt might have done to make herself look pretty. And I don't say that in a trivial way. I think that's part of what's remarkable. I recognize that many people, including people in this room tonight, either they themselves or their close family members, live with that double burden of feeling separated from the world your parents came from, which you only know by story or legend or tradition, and the world that you moved into, maybe as a first generation American, which had its own problem. I will say that the fact of it is that Maxine was highly dependent on her mother as a person who was neither a ghost in the sense of a nearly invisible ancestor, nor an American. And the rest of the stories in the volume show how complicated her story, her upbringing was in depending on her mother, as many children, especially women, found with their own mothers, whether immigrant mothers or not. So, Michael, we must be near the end of the hour.
Yep, we're just at it right now.
Yeah, so I want to make it clear I'm not looking to jump ship, and I want to make it clear that I'm not pretending that I'm more of a woman than the women in the room. And if anyone took what I said as being kind of preachy, I just want to say sometimes if I don't say it, people don't know that I'm feeling it. I will tell you that in a book group once, if I can take another minute or two, I said to a woman that when she said this story could have only been written by a woman or a gay man, and I said, not this story, a story that we were doing. And I said, why would you say that? She said, because it shows such a sensitivity about a woman's life. I don't think a man could have written it. And I said, you don't think a man can write what it's like to be a woman, be like a woman, and without being gay? She said, no, I don't. And I said, well, why are we spending a couple of hours every week for years on this book group if you don't understand the power of imagination? I said, a well written book can tell you what it's like to be a woman. She said, no man can say what it's like to be a woman. Of course he can. He can't write what it's like to be a woman, but good writers can write what it's like to be a woman, including a woman in 19th century St. Petersburg. Good writers can imagine what it's like. I said, a good writer could write what it's like to give birth. And she said to me, that's nonsense. I said, believe me, it's been done. So she said to me, well, you have a distorted view because you're kind of a girly man. And I said, I'll call her Mary. Mary, that's the nicest thing you ever said to me. So this girly man is signing off, hoping you found the story uh, interesting, engaging. I hope also that many of you had never read it before, only because one of the things I'm trying to do in doing these short stories is mix famous stories like The Garden Party with stories that are not so well known, like Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been, or this story or others. And as always, I'm grateful for Michael's collaboration and willingness to, to go along with me.
Well, it's my pleasure. I love working with you, Mark. Definitely provocative story for sure. A very interesting, provocative discussion also. Um, Keep in mind, people, that the next session is in 3 weeks, not 2 weeks, but 3 weeks. And I'm going to send you all a note at the end of next week. And you can tell me if you're going to come in person to see Mark in person. And otherwise,
I feel like Elvis. See me in person. Oh my goodness.
there he is, live in person at the Wilton Library. We'll get neon lights in front of the building for it.
You know, Michael scheduled this for 3 weeks rather than 2 weeks just to build up the anticipation. He's a great impresario.
All right. Have a nice evening, everybody. We'll see you in a few weeks.
Thank you all. Stay well.